My grandfather was the kind of man who never looked for trouble. He was quiet. He was patient. He was respectful. He believed in minding his own business and letting other people mind theirs. He'd lived on that property for decades. He'd raised his family there. He'd built his life there. And he'd never had a serious problem with anyone in his entire life. But then the HOA security team showed up. And everything changed. They started harassing us. Not once. Not twice. But repeatedly. Month after month. They'd show up on our property uninvited. They'd question us about things that were none of their business. They'd make threats. They'd intimidate. They'd act like they had authority over us that they simply didn't have. And every time we complained to the HOA board, nothing happened. Every time we tried to get help through normal channels, we hit a wall. My grandfather tried to be patient. He tried to be reasonable. He tried to handle things the right way. But there's only so much a man can take before he decides that enough is enough. So one evening, without saying a word to anyone, my grandfather walked down to the bridge. He had everything he needed with him. And he sealed it shut. Every entrance. Every exit. Completely locked down. And the HOA security team that had been harassing us for months. They were on the other side of that bridge. Trapped. With no way out. And they stayed that way until morning. Let me tell you about my grandfather first. Because to understand this story, you need to understand who he was. He wasn't just some angry old man looking for a fight. He was a man of principle. A man of patience. A man who had worked hard his entire life to build something meaningful for his family. He'd owned that property for over 40 years. 40 years. That's not just ownership. That's a lifetime of memories. That's decades of work and investment. That's a family legacy. He'd bought the land when it was raw and undeveloped. He'd cleared it. He'd built on it. He'd maintained it. He'd poured his sweat and his savings into making it something special. The property itself was remarkable. It sat in a beautiful area with natural water features running through it. There were trees that had been growing for 100 years. There were fields that the family had farmed for generations. There was a creek that ran through one edge of the property. And there was a bridge. A bridge that my grandfather had actually built himself decades ago. With his own hands. With his own materials. On his own property. That bridge was more than just a structure. It was a symbol. It represented his capability. It represented his independence. It represented his commitment to building something that would last. He was proud of that bridge. He maintained it carefully. He repaired it when it needed repair. It was his. Every inch of it was his. The HOA had been established years after my grandfather bought his property. That's an important detail. He didn't buy into an HOA community. The HOA came to him. The surrounding area developed around his property. New neighborhoods were built. New residents moved in. And eventually, an HOA was formed to manage the community. My grandfather's property was at the edge of this community. His land bordered the HOA territory. And because of the geography of the area, his bridge happened to be a convenient access point. HOA residents would sometimes use the road that crossed his bridge to get to certain parts of the community. It was convenient for them. They'd been doing it for years without any formal agreement. My grandfather had never minded. He was a generous man. He didn't object to people using the bridge as long as they were respectful. As long as they treated his property with care. As long as they acknowledged that they were guests on his land. He was neighborly. He was community-minded. He understood that living near other people meant being cooperative. But then the HOA hired a security team. And that's when everything started to change. The security team was supposed to patrol the HOA community. They were supposed to keep residents safe. They were supposed to enforce HOA rules within the community. That was their job description. That was their mandate. But they didn't stay within their mandate. They started going beyond their boundaries. They started treating my grandfather's property like it was part of their patrol area. They started showing up on his land without permission. They started acting like they had authority over his property. And they did it with an attitude. They did it with arrogance. They did it with the kind of swagger that comes from people who think their uniform gives them unlimited power. The first time the security team crossed onto his property, my grandfather assumed it was a mistake. He politely told them that they were on private property and asked them to leave. They left, but they weren't happy about it. You could see it in their body language. You could see that they didn't like being told what to do by an old man on a piece of land they considered part of their territory. The second time it happened, my grandfather was firmer. He explained clearly that this was his property. He explained that they had no authority here. He explained that they needed to stay on HOA grounds. But they pushed back. They said they had the right to patrol the area. They said the bridge was a community access point. They said he couldn't tell them where they could and couldn't go. And that's when my grandfather realized this wasn't going to be simple. This wasn't going to be resolved with polite conversations. The harassment started small, but it was persistent. The security team would drive onto my grandfather's property several times a week. They'd claim they were just checking things out. They'd claim they were making sure everything was safe. But we all knew what they were really doing. They were asserting dominance. They were showing that they could go wherever they wanted. They were testing boundaries. My grandfather would come outside and ask them to leave. Every single time. He was polite at first. He'd explained that this was private property. He'd explained that they had no business being there. He'd ask them nicely to stay on HOA grounds where they actually had authority. But they'd always have some excuse. They'd say they were investigating a complaint. They'd say they were looking for someone. They'd say they saw something suspicious. But there was never any real reason. There was never any legitimate complaint. There was never any actual suspicious activity. They were just harassing us. They were flexing their authority in a place where they had no authority at all. Then the incidents got worse. One security guard started questioning my grandmother when she was working in her garden. He demanded to know what she was planting. He demanded to know if she had HOA approval for her landscaping. My grandmother was confused. Why would she need HOA approval for her own garden on her own property? She told him to leave. He refused. He stood there arguing with her until my grandfather came out and physically walked him off the property. Another time, they stopped my uncle when he was driving across the bridge. They pulled up behind him with their lights flashing like they were police officers. They demanded to see his identification. They demanded to know where he was going. They treated him like a criminal on his own family's property. My uncle was furious. He called my grandfather immediately. The security team's justification for all of this was always the same. They claimed the bridge was a community access point. They claimed they had the right to patrol it. They claimed they were just doing their jobs. But none of that was true. The bridge was on my grandfather's property. It was built by my grandfather. It was maintained by my grandfather. The HOA had no ownership of it. No legal claim to it. No authority over it. My grandfather decided to file formal complaints with the HOA board. He attended board meetings. He explained what was happening. He provided dates and times of incidents. He brought witnesses. He asked the board to instruct their security team to stay off his property. He was respectful. He was clear. He was reasonable. But the HOA board didn't take him seriously. They made excuses for the security team. They said the guards were just being thorough. They said my grandfather was overreacting. They said the bridge had been used by the community for years, so the security team had every right to patrol it. They completely dismissed his concerns. One board member actually suggested that my grandfather should just donate the bridge to the HOA to avoid future conflicts. Can you imagine? They were harassing him on his own property and then suggesting he should give them that property to make things easier. The arrogance was unbelievable. The harassment continued. And it escalated. The security team started coming by at night. They'd shine their flashlights into the house. They'd drive slowly past the property with their lights on. They were intimidating us. They were making it clear that they could show up whenever they wanted. They were trying to make us feel unsafe in our own home. My grandfather's frustration was building. You could see it in his face. You could hear it in his voice. This man had lived peacefully on his property for 40 years. He'd never bothered anyone. He'd been a good neighbor. And now he was being treated like a criminal by people who had no authority over him. The family was affected too. My grandmother couldn't work in her garden without anxiety. My uncle avoided using the bridge. Family members started feeling uncomfortable visiting the property. The place that had been a sanctuary for decades was becoming a source of stress. And the security team kept coming. They kept harassing. They kept asserting authority they didn't have. Because they thought there was nothing my grandfather could do about it. They thought he was just an old man who would eventually give up and accept their presence. They were wrong. The breaking point came on a Saturday afternoon. The family was having a gathering at my grandfather's property. It was supposed to be a nice day. Cousins were visiting. Kids were playing. We were having a barbecue. Just a normal family get-together on private property. And then the security team showed up. Not one vehicle. 2 vehicles. For security guards total. They drove right onto the property like they owned it. They parked near where we were all gathered. And they got out of their vehicles with that same arrogant attitude they always had. My grandfather walked over to them. He asked them what they wanted. He asked them why they were on his property during a private family event. The lead security guard said they'd received a noise complaint. He said they needed to check it out. He said the gathering might be violating HOA noise ordinances. My grandfather explained, for what felt like the 100th time, that his property was not under HOA jurisdiction. He explained that HOA noise ordinances didn't apply to him. He explained that they needed to leave immediately. But the security guards didn't leave. Instead, they started walking around. They started looking at things. They started taking notes on clipboards like they were conducting some kind of official inspection. One guard walked over to where the kids were playing and told them to keep the noise down. Another guard started examining my grandfather's shed, peering through the windows. Another started taking pictures of vehicles parked on the property. They were completely out of line. They were trespassing. They were harassing a family during a private gathering. My grandfather's patience finally ran out. He raised his voice. He told them in no uncertain terms to get off his property immediately or he would call the police. The security guards laughed. Actually laughed. One of them said, "Go ahead and call the police. We'll tell them about all the violations we're seeing here." That was a threat. A direct threat. They were threatening to make false reports to police because my grandfather was standing up to them. This wasn't security work. This was harassment. This was intimidation. This was abuse of whatever limited authority they thought they had. The family was watching all of this. My uncle was furious and wanted to physically remove the guards. My grandmother was upset and embarrassed that her family gathering was being disrupted. The kids were confused and scared. This should have been a happy day. Instead, it became another incident of harassment. My grandfather did call the police. When the officers arrived, he explained the situation. He explained that these security guards were trespassing on private property. He showed the officers his property boundaries. He explained that the HOA security had no authority here. The police told the security guards to leave. They left, but slowly. Defiantly. Making it clear that they weren't afraid and they'd be back. After that incident, my grandfather had enough. He contacted a lawyer. He wanted to know his options. He wanted to know what he could legally do to stop this harassment once and for all. The lawyer confirmed what my grandfather already knew. His property was his property. The HOA had no authority over it. The security team was trespassing every time they came onto his land. The lawyer sent a formal cease and desist letter to the HOA. The letter clearly stated that the security team was not permitted on my grandfather's property. It stated that any future incidents would result in legal action. It demanded that the HOA instruct their security team to stay off the property permanently. The HOA's response was disappointing but not surprising. They sent back a letter claiming that the bridge was a community easement. They claimed their security had the right to patrol it. They offered no apology. They offered no acknowledgement of wrongdoing. They essentially told my grandfather that the harassment would continue. That's when my grandfather started planning. He didn't tell anyone at first. He just started thinking. He started researching. He started reviewing his property deed. He started examining the bridge's location and ownership. He started thinking about leverage. He started thinking about what would actually make the HOA take him seriously. And then he had an idea. An idea that was bold. An idea that was unconventional. An idea that would send a message so clear that the HOA could never ignore it again. He was going to use the one thing he had that the HOA needed. He was going to use the bridge itself. My grandfather started by studying the bridge more carefully. He walked the entire structure. He examined where it sat on his property. He looked at the property lines on both sides. He reviewed his original property deed. He looked at the survey maps. He wanted to be absolutely certain about one thing. Who owned the bridge? The answer was clear. He owned it. Completely. The bridge sat entirely on his property. Both ends of the bridge were on his land. The structure itself was built by him with his own materials. There was no easement recorded on his deed. There was no legal right-of-way granted to the HOA. There was no agreement that gave anyone else ownership or permanent access rights. The HOA residents had been using the bridge for years, but only because my grandfather had allowed it. It was a courtesy. It was neighborly permission. It wasn't a legal right. He could revoke that permission at any time. Legally, he had every right to restrict access to his own property. He called his lawyer again. He asked a specific question. If he wanted to block access to the bridge, could he legally do that? The lawyer researched the question thoroughly. He reviewed the property deed. He reviewed local access laws. He reviewed easement laws. And he came back with an answer. Yes. My grandfather had every legal right to control access to his own property, including the bridge. The lawyer did warn him that blocking the bridge might upset people. It might cause conflict. The HOA might try to sue for access rights. But legally, my grandfather was on solid ground. He owned the bridge. He could control who used it. And if the HOA wanted permanent access, they would need to negotiate with him and possibly compensate him for an easement. With this legal confirmation, my grandfather started planning the details. He thought about timing. He thought about how to seal the bridge. He thought about what materials he would need. He wasn't just going to put up a simple gate that could be easily removed. He wanted to make a statement. He wanted to make it clear that this was serious. He decided to use concrete barriers. The kind used in construction and road work. Heavy barriers that couldn't just be pushed aside. Barriers that would completely block vehicle access. He quietly arranged to have these barriers delivered to his property. He stored them near the bridge where he could access them quickly when the time came. He also thought about timing. When would be the most effective moment to seal the bridge? When would it have the maximum impact? He wanted the HOA security team to understand exactly what they'd lost through their harassment. He wanted them to experience the consequences directly. Then he waited for the right moment. He didn't have to wait long. The security team continued their patrols. They continued driving across his bridge multiple times per week. They continued acting like they owned the place. They had no idea what was coming. My grandfather finally told the family about his plan a few days before he executed it. The reactions were mixed. My grandmother was worried. She didn't want more conflict. She wanted peace. My uncle was enthusiastic. He thought it was brilliant. He offered to help. My father was concerned about legal consequences but trusted my grandfather's judgment. My grandfather assured everyone that he'd checked with his lawyer. He assured them that this was legal. He assured them that he had every right to control access to his own property. And he assured them that this was the only way the HOA would finally take him seriously. One evening, just as the sun was setting, my grandfather decided it was time. The security team was on their patrol route. He knew their schedule by now. He knew they would cross the bridge and patrol the far section of the HOA community. He knew they'd be on the other side of the bridge for at least an hour during their rounds. So he gathered his equipment. He called my uncle to help him. And together, they went down to the bridge. They positioned the concrete barriers at both ends. Heavy, solid, unmovable barriers. They completely blocked vehicle access. No one was driving across that bridge. Not tonight. Not until my grandfather decided to remove those barriers. And right on schedule, about an hour later, the HOA security team finished their patrol on the far side. They drove back toward the bridge to return to their security office. And that's when they discovered what my grandfather had done. They were trapped. The security team pulled up to the bridge and saw the concrete barriers immediately. They stopped their vehicle. They got out to examine the situation. You could imagine their confusion at first. Then their confusion turned to anger. They tried to move the barriers. They pushed. They pulled. But those barriers weighed hundreds of pounds each. They weren't moving without heavy equipment. One of the security guards immediately called my grandfather. His phone rang. He answered calmly. The guard was yelling. He was demanding that my grandfather remove the barriers immediately. He was saying this was illegal. He was saying they needed to get through. My grandfather's response was simple and calm. He said, "That's my bridge on my property. I've decided to restrict access. You're not permitted to use it anymore." The security guard threatened him. He said he'd call the police. He said my grandfather would be in legal trouble. He said this was obstruction. My grandfather remained calm. He said, "Go ahead and call the police. I'm within my legal rights to control access to my own property. You've been trespassing for months. Now you're experiencing what happens when you disrespect property rights." The security team did call the police. They reported that they were blocked from accessing their route. When the police arrived, they assessed the situation. The officers spoke with the security guards. Then they called my grandfather. They asked him about the barriers. My grandfather explained that this was his private property. He explained that he'd revoked permission for anyone to use his bridge. He explained that he had every legal right to do this. The police confirmed this with dispatch. They reviewed the property information. And they told the security guards exactly what my grandfather knew they'd say. The bridge was private property. The owner had the right to restrict access. There was nothing illegal about what my grandfather had done. If the security team wanted access, they'd need to find another route. But here's the problem. There was no other route. Not an easy one anyway. The geography of the area meant that the bridge was the direct access point to and from that section of the HOA community. Without the bridge, the security team would have to drive miles out of their way. They'd have to take back roads. They'd have to go all the way around the area. What normally took 10 minutes would now take over an hour. And it was getting dark. And the security guard shift was supposed to end. And they wanted to go home. But they couldn't. Not without driving way out of their way. They were stuck. The security team called the HOA president. They explained what had happened. The HOA president was furious. She immediately called my grandfather. She demanded that he remove the barriers. She said he was being unreasonable. She said he was causing problems for the entire community. She said this was unacceptable. My grandfather's response was measured but firm. He reminded her of the months of harassment. He reminded her of the complaints he'd filed that she'd ignored. He reminded her of the security team trespassing on his property repeatedly. He reminded her of the cease and desist letter his lawyer had sent. And then he told her that the bridge would remain closed until the HOA was ready to have a serious conversation about respecting his property rights. The HOA president tried to negotiate. She tried to convince him to just open it for the night. She promised they'd talk about it tomorrow. But my grandfather held firm. He said the barriers would stay in place. The conversation was over. Word spread through the HOA community quickly. Residents started hearing about what happened. Some were angry at my grandfather. They saw him as being petty and vindictive. They complained that he was inconveniencing everyone just to make a point. But others understood. Others knew about the harassment. Others had seen how the security team operated. Others thought my grandfather was justified. The security guard sat in their vehicle on the far side of the bridge for hours. They eventually had to drive the long route home. What should have been a 10-minute drive turned into over an hour of navigating back roads in the dark. They were furious. They were humiliated. They were experiencing firsthand what it meant to lose access to something they'd taken for granted. The HOA board held an emergency meeting that night. They discussed what to do. They discussed whether they could force my grandfather to open the bridge. They discussed legal options. But their lawyer told them the same thing my grandfather's lawyer had told him. He owned the property. He had the right to restrict access. They had no legal claim to use his bridge. The board realized they had a serious problem. Their security team couldn't effectively patrol without that bridge. Their residents were angry. And they had no leverage. My grandfather had all the leverage now. The next morning, the HOA president called my grandfather early. Her tone was completely different from the night before. She wasn't demanding anymore. She wasn't making threats. She was asking. Almost pleading. She said the board wanted to meet with him. She said they wanted to discuss a solution. She said they were willing to listen to his concerns. My grandfather agreed to meet with them. But he didn't remove the barriers yet. He wanted them to understand that he was serious. He wanted them to understand that access to his bridge was a privilege, not a right. The barriers stayed in place. The meeting happened that afternoon. The entire HOA board was there. The security team supervisor was there too. Everyone looked uncomfortable. Everyone knew this meeting was happening because my grandfather had leverage they couldn't counter. He owned something they desperately needed. My grandfather started the meeting by laying out everything that had happened. Every incident of harassment. Every trespassing event. Every time he'd filed a complaint that was ignored. Every time the security team had overstepped their authority. He documented everything. He had dates. He had details. He had witnesses. The board couldn't deny any of it. Then he stated his terms. First, the security team was to stay off his property completely. No exceptions. No patrols across his bridge. No access to his land. If they needed to patrol areas on the other side, they would need to use alternative routes. Second, he wanted a formal written apology from the HOA acknowledging that they'd allowed harassment to continue despite his complaints. Third, he wanted assurance that there would be consequences for the security guards who'd been trespassing and harassing his family. The board members looked at each other. They whispered among themselves. The HOA president asked if he would reopen the bridge if they agreed to his terms. My grandfather said he would consider allowing limited access, but only under strict conditions. Only after they'd proven they could respect his property rights. Only after real changes had been made. The security supervisor spoke up. He tried to defend his team. He tried to say they were just doing their jobs. But my grandfather cut him off. He said, "Your job is to patrol HOA property. My land is not HOA property. Your team has been trespassing for months. That's not security work. That's harassment." The board president asked what it would take for my grandfather to trust them again. He said he needed to see real accountability. He needed to see the security guards who'd harassed his family removed from duty. He needed to see policy changes that clearly defined where security could and couldn't patrol. He needed to see respect. Within a week, changes started happening. 2 of the security guards who'd been most aggressive in their harassment were let go. The HOA issued a formal apology letter to my grandfather. They sent it certified mail. They acknowledged that security had overstepped boundaries. They acknowledged that they'd failed to address his complaints appropriately. The HOA also established new patrol boundaries. They created maps clearly showing where security was authorized to patrol. My grandfather's property was explicitly marked as off-limits. The security team received new training about property rights and legal boundaries. They were told in no uncertain terms that trespassing on private property would result in immediate termination. The community's reaction was mixed. Some residents were angry at the inconvenience of the bridge being closed. They complained on community forums. They said my grandfather was being vindictive. But others spoke up in his defense. Other residents shared their own stories of security overreach. Other people talked about how the security team had harassed them too. The conversation opened up issues that the HOA board had been ignoring. Some residents actually thanked my grandfather. They said he'd done what they'd been afraid to do. He'd stood up to the HOA and the security team. He demanded accountability. And he'd won. After 2 weeks of negotiations and changes, my grandfather agreed to reopen the bridge. But he didn't just remove the barriers and forget about it. He installed a gate. A gate that he controlled. A gate that could be closed if the agreement was violated. He made it clear that access was conditional. Access depended on the HOA and their security team respecting his property. The HOA agreed to these terms. They had no choice. They needed that bridge. And my grandfather had shown them that he was willing to use his leverage if they disrespected him again. So what can you learn from my grandfather's story? What are the real lessons here? Because this isn't just about one man and one bridge. This is about principles that apply to anyone dealing with harassment, overreach, or abuse of authority. The first lesson is about knowing what you own. My grandfather knew his property boundaries. He knew what was his and what wasn't. He'd kept his deed. He'd kept his surveys. He'd kept his documentation. And when the conflict came, that knowledge became power. If he hadn't known exactly where his property lines were, if he hadn't known that he owned the bridge completely, he wouldn't have had leverage. So know what you own. Understand your property. Keep your documentation. Because that knowledge protects you. The second lesson is about documentation. My grandfather documented every incident of harassment. Every date. Every time the security team trespassed. Every complaint he filed. Every response he got from the HOA. When he finally met with the board, he had evidence. He had proof. He wasn't just complaining. He was presenting facts. Documentation turns your word against theirs into undeniable evidence. Always document harassment. Always keep records. Always save emails and letters. Because when the time comes to defend yourself, documentation is your strongest weapon. The third lesson is about not accepting abuse from authority figures. The security team had uniforms. They had vehicles with lights. They acted like they had authority. And many people would have just accepted that. Many people would have assumed that security guards must have the right to do what they were doing. But my grandfather didn't accept it. He questioned their authority. He researched his rights. He discovered that their authority was limited. Just because someone acts like they have power doesn't mean they actually do. Question authority when it seems wrong. Research your rights. Don't just comply because someone has a uniform or a title. The fourth lesson is about finding your leverage. My grandfather could have kept complaining to the HOA board forever. He could have kept asking them nicely to control their security team. He could have kept hoping they'd do the right thing. But complaining wasn't working. Being nice wasn't working. So he found leverage. He identified something he controlled that the HOA needed. And he used it. In any conflict, there's usually leverage somewhere. You just have to find it. What do you control that the other side needs? What can you withhold that matters to them? What power do you have that you're not using? Find your leverage and use it strategically. The fifth lesson is about being willing to take bold action. Sealing the bridge was bold. It was dramatic. It was unconventional. Most people wouldn't have done it. Most people would have worried too much about what others would think. Most people would have been afraid of conflict. But my grandfather understood that sometimes bold action is necessary. Sometimes you have to do something dramatic to get people's attention. Sometimes you have to be willing to cause disruption to create change. Don't be afraid of bold action when it's justified and legal. The sixth lesson is about standing up for family. My grandfather wasn't just protecting himself. He was protecting his wife, his children, his grandchildren. He was protecting the family property and the family legacy. When his family was harassed, he took action. When his family gathering was disrupted, that was the final straw. Family loyalty drove him to take risks he might not have taken just for himself. Protecting your family is worth fighting for. Standing up for the people you love gives you strength and courage you might not otherwise have. The seventh lesson is about patience combined with firmness. My grandfather tried the polite approach first. He tried complaining through proper channels. He tried being reasonable. He gave the HOA multiple chances to do the right thing. But when those approaches failed, he didn't just give up. He shifted strategies. He became firm. He took action. This combination of patience and firmness is important. Give people chances to do the right thing. But when they refuse, be prepared to escalate. Be prepared to use the tools you have. The eighth lesson is about legal knowledge protecting you. My grandfather consulted with a lawyer. He made sure he understood his legal rights before taking action. He made sure that sealing the bridge was legal. He made sure he had the right to control access to his property. That legal knowledge protected him when the police were called. It protected him when the HOA threatened legal action. It gave him confidence to take bold action knowing he was on solid legal ground. Don't take major action without understanding the legal implications. Consult with professionals. Know your rights. Make sure you're legally protected before you act. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever dealt with HOA harassment? Have you ever had security or authority figures overstep their boundaries? Have you ever found unexpected leverage in a conflict? Share your stories in the comments. I want to hear how you stood up for your rights. If this story inspired you, hit that like button. Subscribe to this channel for more stories about property rights and standing up to unfair authority. And remember, you have more power than you think. You have rights that are worth defending. Sometimes all it takes is understanding what you control and being willing to use it. My grandfather proved that. One bridge. One bold decision. And everything changed.